This channel has made many power rankings tier lists over the years, and despite my attempts to be as objective as possible by building and testing every single character, it still remains that one cannot escape the sometimes true accusations of bias that will always be part of making a tier list. But that doesn't mean we're not going to try. So not only have I built and tested every single character in Genshin Impact, I have assembled DPS calculations for every single character in the game, cross-referencing multiple theory crafters' numbers, opinions, and added my own experience building teams and playing these units to make the first quote-unquote objective tier list, or at least as much as possible, for the power rankings of Genshin Impact. Let's get started. Welcome to Jello Impact, where we build and test every single character to help you decide who you want to wish for and build. The version Luna 2 banners featuring Nefer and Farina are finally here. If you're planning on spending for these or any future banners, let me recommend Loot Bar. I have been personally using Loot Bar for over a year, and I've spent thousands of dollars on my personal account. They are safe, using currency exchange to get you discounts on the crystals you were going to buy anyways. They have tens of thousands of 5-star reviews. They're very easy to use. Just choose the pack you want, enter your UID and region, and your top up is delivered in minutes. New users also get a 10% coupon. New users clicking my link also get access to a $2 welcome. Returning users get a 5% and 3% discounts. And if you plan on buying currency for Miliastra Wonderland or other games like Honkai Star Rail or Zenless Zone Zero, you can also do that through Loot Bar. It's partnerships like these that allow me to continue bringing the content I do to the channel, as well as supporting my family. So thanks to Loot Bar for sponsoring the video. Number one, we're making this tier list as of version 6.1. A lot of people wonder why not wait for the Hex and Circle buffs with Durin. The reality is, anytime we do this tier list, there's gonna be a patch with big things coming. If I do this patch after Durin, it'll take a couple of weeks to actually let everything settle after the Durin buff, after Durin patch, and also all the Hex and Circle buffs come out. It's gonna be difficult to really get a handle on it until at least 2 or 3 weeks, and by then we'll have Columbina information and she'll be shaking up the meta, and it's like, why don't you wait for that? And we'll just be waiting till Shenhe Nahida. So we're gonna release it now and do another update to the tier list when that comes out. The reality is this took an absolutely astronomical amount of work to put together, but I do think that over time, now that we have everything in place, it will be easier. So before we get into everything, what does it mean to be objective? Well, first we have 2 lines of rankings, the on-field and the off-field section. We have 3 different criteria, all with a weighted ranking. Total team power. So for example, for the on-field, we have total team power, team building, practicality, and they're all weighted. So power is weighted the highest, team building second, team building and practicality are both weighted a bit lower. Every DPS number range corresponds to a score. Team building is how easy is it to make a good team. I know this is a bit vague, and trust me, I did try a bunch of systems to try and make it more objective, but the reality is it's a bit vague, so we kind of just have to go by this one feels like a 5, this one feels worse than that at a 4, this one feels a middle ground, these feel about the same as that, so that's about a 3.5, whatever. That's kind of how we do team building. It's a bit more of a comparison. And then practicality, characters lose points for being mechanically difficult, having big ER needs, lack of interruption, low survivability, lack of multi-wave, etc. Whatever seems important. We're not really punishing, lack of AoE, for example, as Stygian Onslaught is what we're considering the most for this tier list, because I feel as long as you can clear Stygian Onslaught, you can pretty easily clear the Spiral Abyss, so not too much value in looking at the Spiral Abyss. Overall, if we ever get floor 13 or something, then AoE and multi-wave might make a comeback as being more important. Off-field have a similar thing, but we actually have more categories. So we have total team power, but total team power for off-fielders is a bit different. We don't just look at the top team for an off-fielder, we look at an average of their 3 top teams because people expect a certain amount of versatility from their off-fielders, whereas DPS don't need to run a ton of different teams to be a good DPS. As long as that team works against the majority of content, it's fine. For example, Skirk, she can breeze through all Stygian onslaughts without needing a ton of variety of teams. If that ever changes, then we can punish that, but as of now, that's not kind of how it works. But for off-fielder, it's different. If an off-fielder only works on with one carry, then that's not so good, obviously. So we average their top 3 teams, and then from there we look at their flexibility, which is overall how many teams that they can have. I know that has a little bit of overlap with the total team power, but that's okay. Flexibility is like almost the teams that it's like not just the number of teams, but it's the number of teams they actually contribute on. And then total team powers is the average of their top 3 actual teams, regardless of whether they contribute on them or not. Does that make sense? It's a little bit not as great, but it is at least internally consistent for the most. We look at their personal damage, their offensive utility, defensive utility, practicality, and those are all weighted. So again, power is weighted the most, offensive utility is weighted the second most by quite a bit, flexibility is next, personal damage, practicality, and then last is defensive utility. Although it's important, you can kind of get defensive utility from anywhere. Sometimes carries will have defensive utility, so it's less important. So without further ado, let's pop out to the lowest tier, tier 6, which we've named, or tier 6 and 5 are both named bad. So we'll just reveal it all at once. I don't want to drag it out too much, especially with the lowest characters. You know, appearing on both sides, we've got Amber, just really not contributing much. We can take a look on the off-field category. She has a total team power of 3. I'm not going to do this for every character, but just so you can see how it works, it means her teams usually get around 70k DPS. If we just looked, or 60 to 70k, if we just looked at her top team, maybe a Kaniche burning team or something, it might be higher. But since we have to look at the top 3, it's not looking too hot now, is it? For flexibility, we have a 0. And so why do so many of these characters have 0? You can obviously put them on a bunch of teams. What we did, and when I say we, I am talking about me. I am a bit talking about chat. I am also a bit talking about my podcast co-host, April, who also is a guest appearance on a lot of my streams. Make sure to check out that podcast, by the way. But she also constructed this whole sheet, so big thanks to her. She's also one of our Discord mods, and I highly recommend you join our Discord if you need help with meta or any of this stuff, or if you want further clarification on why a character is where. Our Discord team is pretty much generally universally on board with all the rankings on the tier list, so you can get extra explanation from them. But anyways, Amber, 0 for flexibility. What we decided was that if you're a downgrade to free unit options and a strict DPS loss, you get a 0 for flexibility. And I know she has some kind of uses against Lava Dragon stuff, but it's a bit too niche to really count. Personal damage, we have a 1. Offensive utility with a 2. This is her pyro application is what we're considering. And then defensive utility being a 0. Practicality is 4. She's not too bad. She has some energy issues, but overall it's whatever. So for an overall of 10.2. The only characters with worse are Electro and Hydro Traveler only having a 2 in offensive utility. I don't even honestly know what that is for. I don't remember what we gave it to. For all I know, all intents and purposes, I don't even know why they have a 2. It's been a while since I ranked Hydro Traveler. Apologies. I know there's some characters such as Traveler, Geo Traveler that, you know, they give something, you know, crit rate buff, you know, some damage. But when you're a downgrade to a free character like Keqing, it becomes hard to justify ranking the Traveler any higher, and a substantial downgrade to Keqing. So that's, you know, a lot of what hurts the Geo Traveler there. Moving over to tier 5, let's take maybe someone like Noelle as our option and our example for this tier. So if we go over to on-field, we look at Noelle C6, we look at her double Hydro team. It calcs here for about 67k. Flip, a creator on YouTube who I always link in the description, I actually commissioned him to start making this whole list, and so he calced Noelle actually at 62k DPS. And what I also do is cross-reference that with other theory crafters if I can find calcing on characters like Noelle, which oftentimes I can for the unpopular characters. And then I also cross-reference with a website like GC Sim. So GC Sim has its ups and downs. This is Noelle calcing at around 67k, which is what I have here. The main difference is Flip calced Marchese Hunter Noelle. This one uses Archaic Petra, although this one uses Marchese as well. One way or another, there's a small discrepancy, but that's okay. I cross-reference both, and then I often will give the benefit of the doubt to the higher one for a character, especially when they're as low as this. So 67k, that gives her a score of 3. We're pretty harsh on the character's DPS because 67k is not really clearing anything, so we're not going to give a very high score. Team building, we give a 1. there's very, very little flexibility in team building with a character like Noelle. Very few team options. Practicality, it's not so bad. She does have high energy issues, but when it comes down to actually playing it, it's not so bad. And then after the weights, it comes out to a score of 9.3. Someone like Ito has around the same DPS, so gets the same score for DPS. If you think it's a little higher or lower, it doesn't end up mattering because it's within the same range, so they end up getting the same score anyways. A bit better team building because Ito has Moika options and stuff that are a bit better, but still end up being around the same DPS. But he has a lower practicality score because his combos are actually quite difficult to execute, and also has the same atrocious ER needs. And again, even if you wanted to put this to a 7, it's not like it changes the ranking that much. And that brings me to another point. It's why I didn't want to rank the characters within tiers. Because although, yes, it is made to be as objective as possible, and yes, every character has an absolute numerical score where we could really, if we wanted, try and double down and get an exact score for everyone. At the end of the day, if you change a score by 1 here and there, it's not usually going to affect their tier, which tier they're in, but it might affect their tier placement. And I just don't think that anyone can be perfectly accurate. There's always an element of subjectivity. Maybe you think Ito is not quite as hard as a 6, he might be a 7. He's certainly not a 10 though, and he's probably not a 4. So at least, if it's somewhere in the range, then they'll ideally be somewhere in the range. There's a couple characters that might be switched like that, depending on how you order it. And that's where the subjectivity comes in. And you know what? That's okay. We do our best. It's not going to be perfect. So characters like Noelle, Ito, and then there's a character that a bunch of people are probably going to talk about, and this is one of the reasons why it's like, why aren't you waiting for, the Hex and Circle buffs or doing it with them in mind? There still could be changes, okay? And there could be big things that are wrong. We still don't have proper calcs for characters like Klee. There's a bunch of stuff that we just need testing to see. And it's like, it's hard to believe that Razor might be a super top DPS, but for characters like Razor that we know are getting a buff, I have put a little star. So characters with a star are receiving a direct buff soon, may or may not change the placement. For Razor, they definitely will. Also, there's a couple other things in the legend, but something like the C6, without this constellation, they likely don't belong in this tier. That doesn't mean they necessarily do, but they would go down a tier, but the constellation still is important overall for that character. For a lot of the characters, especially where it's not as obvious, I've named the team that they're using. So Fremine is being carried by a Scoffier. Ning Wang is doing a Moika Ning dual carry, but I did make sure for characters like Ning Wang, beautiful character, really wish she was better. Hope they give her a 5-star version sometime, or she gets a buff with leeway or something. But regardless, I did make sure that she was doing most of the damage on her team. So here we have Ning Wang Moika, where Ning Wang is doing over double the damage of Moika. We're getting 67k DPS. Flip has him on 72, or Flip has him on 66. GC Sim has it on 72 or 75. So I split the difference and I went for 72. But I did give her a 0 for team building since she basically needs this team. And I did give her a low practicality score because she's really annoying to play. Very, very annoying and very mechanically intensive. Tartaglia, it's sad that he's in such a bad state. One of the coolest characters, in the story, design wise, so cool. Really, really awful. Hasn't received any sort of meaningful upgrade in years, only really meta relevant in AoE back in the day, and the DPS is just way too low, and he's so difficult to play. So yeah, Tartaglia. A lot of people are upset that Tartaglia is lower than Ayato, but unfortunately, just nothing we can do. The numbers, they speak for themselves. It's not about vibes, it's about numbers. So this is the bad tier, and these are the characters that are there. Other standouts, maybe Wonderbite Beto's here. In the meta of Siege and Onslaught, your damage falling off in single target is an absolute death sentence, and she's very clunky to play. Characters like Toma, Burgeon is just not useful in any capacity. Dia has no relevance anymore. A character like Yunjin has some kind of strong buffs, but again, being a downgrade to free options really hurts. And then Goro just being an alright buffer. So if we look at the off-field character, someone like Goro, he's at the very top of this tier, fairly close to the next tier up, but really held back by that total team power score, right? You can see the offensive utility Goro provides is amazing, quite good. Like 7 it's higher than all the other characters you can see on the screen here, and some good practicality, a little bit of defensive utility. You could even bump that up maybe, I guess, and that might kick him up, but we'll just leave it for now. It's just that total team power, Ito teams being his only relevant teams, and then not even being on the best Ito teams. It's It's just that we don't have a character that scales well off defense to do damage. Hopefully one day, you know, that can change. So yeah, that is tier 5. We're calling it bad. Next is the simps only tier. So these are characters that you could play, but I only would recommend playing them if you simp for them. So we've got a number of characters, another couple of characters that are receiving buffs, Venti and Albedo. And you can see they both have the stars. Klee also has the stars. They are going to skyrocket in value. Venti is going to go up at least a couple tiers. Albedo going to go up at least a couple tiers. Klee going to go up at least probably 3 tiers, especially if you get C1 for free. That's going to be crazy. So definitely keep an eye out for those characters and as they go up. But let's take a look at some examples. So for Onfyo, let's take a look at yoimiya. She's clocking in at 74k DPS. I do believe this is overload, but melt is around that range as well. She will also receive an upgrade from Duran, so look forward to that. Puts her at a total team power of 4. We gave her a 4 for team building because she actually has quite a lot of teams that are around this DPS level. Overload, double hydro, melt, and there's an Efa over vape. There's a bunch of different options for those, and they're all around this DPS level. So she gets a pretty high team building score. She gets a really low practicality score. Number 1, only single target in a way that is so painful. Like, even when you need just the tiniest bit of AoE, she just has none. Getting interrupted and missing your combo, really bad. Having too much application to properly do anything, she just gets really, really hurt. And also, her best combos needing macros to work, which if you don't know what macros is, don't even worry about it. It's like an extra program you download, which is not allowed anyways. She just needs help, man. I feel like we're actually a little harsh on her here for that practicality. I feel like this is a little more consistent, but as you can, with what else we have going on here, but as you can see, it doesn't actually change, you know, her placement as much, but that's why I don't want to order it. So, okay. We look at some other characters. Ayato, you know, he is an Escoffier driver, and he's got the same team power, a lower team building score, but he's a bit carried by his practicality. Very easy to pilot Ayato. You're going to be getting, you only get 74k DPS, you know, but by golly, are you going to get that 74k DPS every single time? Eula also showing up in this tier as an Escoffier driver. She really is carried though. She has no other options for teams. We've got a couple Efa drivers in here, so you can take a look at why the characters are where they are. Kave clocking it at a pretty high DPS number, 80k, you know, really quite an impressive DPS number, but as he is hard locked to basically exactly one specific team and being a DPS loss on that team, gets a 0 for team building and 8 for practicality, so ends up continuing to hang around that tier. I will say the DPS list is a bit more scuffed towards the lower tiers, you know, with the ratings, because of the nature of Genshin Impact, where some teams can just carry other characters to heights that they could never reach by themselves. So it ends up being like a little bit, the ranking system is a bit more scuffed with the lower tiers, but you'll see in the higher tiers how it's quite a bit more accurate and a bit more objective. Moving on to tier 3, which I would call underpowered. So these characters are not bad, they're not awful, they're not useless. I would just say that they're underpowered, and I really think that that is, you know, the adjective that to me best describes them. They can do some stuff, but they just leave you at the end of the day, especially if you actually care about, you know, things like Stygian Onslaught, they just end up leaving you wanting a bit more. Someone like Alhaitham, he's not bad, but, you know, you got to give him Lauma, the Hydro, the Hyper Bloom, and then at the end of the day, it's only 86k DPS. It's a downgrade from using Lauma on field. So we give him his total team power of 6.5, his team building. He has a little bit of flexibility, you know, what Hydro slot, what Electro slot you use, but basically he's just a Lauma driver. And then practicality, he doesn't come stock with interruption resistance. In Stygian, not starting with mirrors is really quite annoying, actually. So yeah, Alhaitham ends up being here. You know, we've got characters, we've got Sucrose, you know, being an Efa driver and just being carried based off of that. Same with Aoife, same sort of thing. Ganyu, it's just an Escoffier driver and she's hard to play. So even though, yeah, so it keeps her fairly low down. Sethos, also essentially an Efa driver. Diluc, his plunge, doing decent damage, but again, I think a little bit difficult to hit all the melts and to do it within the Bennett infusion uptime. It is difficult, especially with the ER needs in Stygian Onslaught. You don't see a lot of Diluc clears without C2 Shenyun, C2 Citlali, you don't see it. Pyro Traveler, it's an overload team. It does decently. Xiao, with his best team, he's got a bit better DPS than Wanderer if you do his Jet Plunge tech, but he is very restricted to one team with very little going on. I don't think the jet plunge is too hard. It's like basically you're plunging a bit before the top of his jump. Xiao mains will know what I mean. We've got Sino. Sino, I gave him a 0 in flexibility because he takes Inefa and Lauma for this team, and I'm throwing him a bone because he's kind of bad and I feel bad for him. I actually shouldn't do this. I'm being extremely charitable to Sino here, but it's the only thing I've seen calced as well. I didn't allow Novelette to use Inefa and Lauma together because I feel like you're just griefing your teams, but it's more for Novelette, at least it can be interpreted as a term of respect, because I do think Novelette's strong enough to stand without being carried by both Inefa and Lauma, which again make up the core for two really meta teams, especially in the current Stygian Onslaught meta, whereas Sino really doesn't have that luxury. He kind of needs both to clear, so he gets to use them, but he's punished with a 0 in team building, and he's decent in practicality. If you have both, you know, you've got an Effa for shielding, and it's not so bad. I feel like he still does have really long uptime though, so maybe it still hurts practicality a little bit. So anyway, it's the survivability aspect, the energy. He's got a lot of really annoyances, which are mostly solved, to be fair, with the Inefa Lauma team, but it's still, you know, and Xingqiu does make that shield very strong, you know, but yeah, the energy is still quite substantial. Alhaitham, Risley is just a Escoffier carry, and Melt technically does receive the same DPS, but it's very difficult to do. So he has a little bit of flexibility with his teams, but not particularly high. Linny has the highest DPS out of the characters on this list, but I haven't seen very many people, if any, really actually play Linny optimally, especially at the C0 level. Very, very difficult to do. So we give him his DPS. He's got a decent amount of options for teams. He's got Overloaded, he's got Vape, some people do Melt, but overall his practicality score really suffers. So it's just difficult to do. And then Raiden 80k, she's got a few teams that can do 80k, but it's mostly Overloaded stuff. So a bit lower of team power, but a bit higher of practicality since, you know, it's Raiden, she's got infinite interruption resistance. So that's the on-field. For the support section, so you can take a nice gander at the image here. Again, not ordered in any particular way. We've got Mika a little lower on the team power. Again, it has to be the average of your top 3 teams. So sure, he has Skirk, but other than that, gets brought down quite a bit. Offensive utility, defensive utility, practicality. Chongyun, a higher team power, works with both Skirk and Melt, so ends up being a bit higher. Same thing for other stuff up there. We have Dahlia, who has a lower score because only works with Skirk. So for team power, the average of the top 3 teams is lower down, but he is kind of actually contributing to that Skirk team, and sometimes Dahlia is actually like a competitive option with like real premium options due to the offensive utility of the attack speed, the defensive utility, and just overall being a very comfy character to use with Skirk. So despite being punished for not having a bunch of teams, is actually best in slot on one. And I know there's a little bit of an issue here, right? Where there's a little bit of an issue where our flexibility score, the word flexibility doesn't exactly accurately represent what's going on here. And so I just want you to know I get that. It makes more sense, again, in the higher tiers. In the lower tiers, we have to do a bit of juggling to make it make sense, because yeah, Chongyun has more teams, but less that he's best in slot in. Dahlia has less teams, but more that he's best in slot in. So flexibility is like almost the teams that it's like not just the number of teams, but it's the number of teams they actually contribute on. And then total team powers is the average of their top 3 actual teams, regardless of whether they contribute on them or not. Does that make sense? It's a little bit not as great, but it is at least internally consistent for the most. I had to go through and adjust some of these in here. A lot of them were using the old rules where we just looked at the best team instead of looking at all 3, like an average of 3. So now they're more averaged out. I do want to highlight someone like Chiori. Total team power of 7. She actually has a bunch of teams that has this power level in, but again, just a downgrade to a free unit in all of them. Not always even Kachina, just sometimes Sucrose, sometimes other units, just never, always a DPS loss to put this character on your team. And her personal damage is actually like really kind of bad, sometimes even worse than this. When she doesn't have another construct on the team, it's actually really, really tragic. Very little offensive utility, just offering Geo-Resonance with her consistent crystallized shields, which also gives her some defensive utility. Hey, but at least she's easy and simple to play. At least it feels comfy. Yeah. overall, very, very sad. Another character like Baiju, you know, sure, he's got some teams that can do some damage, you know, overall average power of 7 between Novelette teams, Nefer teams, and just other stuff, Branham stuff, but still always a downgrade even to free units. I don't know. He's got 1 personal damage from Clam, tiny bit of offensive utility, good healing, but really high energy issues, honestly, as well, and just overall just character that needs a buff. A lot of these characters, like I said, they're not all bad. They do something, they're just underpowered, you know? They're not all bad, they're just underpowered. So that is the tier 3 underpowered tier. Moving on to usable or good. So usable or good, what do we have for DPS? Let's do one at a time now. We've got, this is where we're really getting into some things now. So Kokomi at the bottom here, a bit lower on the total team power. We're counting her mono hydro team, not her, you know, Lauma driver team, because that's not really a real Kokomi team. I feel like her mono hydro team is something that she actually contributes on. Very little flexibility on that team to achieve DPS. You can, you know, swap out Yelan for Singcho or something like that, and it's, you know, not, it does lose a lot of damage though, so very little team building flexibility. But you can do both the Escoffier driver version or the mono hydro driving version. The Escoffier one, you actually build Escoffier for no ER, so just for damage. So, and Kokomi being a healer allows you to do that, so it does give her some functionality on that Escoffier team. And then you have mono hydro as well, which is worse, but at least it's something. And then a good practicality, she's very easy. So overall, you know, I feel like that this distance between these two tiers justifies a break in the placement. So yeah, that's Kokomi. Gaming was one of the hardest characters to score on the entire list, to be honest. Because he has a very high sheeted damage. So if you look at, you know, Zajeff's calcs or Flip's calcs, sometimes they're even higher than this, depending on who you're looking at. And so that gives him a very solid 8. That's by far the highest we've seen on the list so far. Very, very high DPS numbers. And team building is honestly not that bad either. Yeah, you kind of need Seatlali. You kind of want Bennett, which does take away some points. So, you know, only a 3. But the last slot is pretty flexible. It could be Sucrose, Shalonen, or Shen Yun, but for practicalities where he takes the biggest hit is 4. Now I know there are some Gaming players that play him well, and if you think that if you can consistently play Gaming well, you know, plug in your number and say, I can play Gaming well, and I think he's an 8 for practicality, then he shoots up into the next tier, or maybe more. We can even play around with that later, right? But I think he's a 4 for practicality, because he's very difficult. You know, on the same level as Sethos Walk Cancel, on the same level as Klee. Yeah, so I think Gaming is pretty difficult to use, and most people are just not going to be able to, and so I want the tier list to reflect that. Character like Nilou, this is her Nilou teams with Lauma, so because her total team power 7.5, in AoE, we could bump that up. We could bump up her practicality, but in single target, yeah, it's a 7.5. I'm going to change that practicality to 9. I think this is a very easy team to play, but yeah, this is Lauma. Team building I have is a 2. You need Lauma really bad, and she completely falls off without Lauma. You need Nahida pretty bad, honestly, to get good, you know, off-field Dendro app. So for that reason, needing basically 2 specific limited 5 stars, it goes down to a 2. Plus, it takes away Lauma from a Hyper Bloom team, which for a DPS loss, which is bad, and then a good practicality. Yelan. So a lot of people were giving me heck for having Yelan at this placement. But if we look at Flip's calcs for Yelan, she's clocking it at an incredibly high 94.5k DPS. So I could actually I rounded down to 94k. You could actually probably bump that up to 95, but I rounded it down. She's doing also by far the most damage on the team. This is Yelan, Farina, Escoffier, Seatlali. So a very, very impressive showing. If you look on GC Sim, she's at 95.6. I do think this rotation's a bit unrealistic. That's the thing with GC Sim. But yeah, very, very impressive. So we gave her a 7 for team power, and then team building a 2.5 and a practicality of 9. She's very easy to play, just normal attacking. She has some team building because it's not just Escoffier locked because of the double hydro variants. Double hydro variants will hurt her DPS, but that's one of the reasons why I'm kind of okay letting her rounding down to 94 instead of 95, as this does allow her to consider, for the purposes of this tier list, the mono hydro variants and not just the Escoffier carry variants. Otherwise, we'd put our team building lower if we're looking at one specific exact team. Next is Navia. Navia has the lowest DPS on this list, or close to it, along with Kokomi by far, but due to her options of Moika or double Hydra variants or even plunge variants, all achieving a fairly similar amounts of DPS and her being very, very easy to play, she ends up staying in this tier. Hu Tao making a great showing after all this time. We are counting her C1 as it is guaranteed to choose from the selector. Inefa Overvape, actually a fairly impressive DPS calc. Some people I think have it even calced higher than this, like quite a bit, except that I do believe that it's with C6 Ino. Flip only has it calced at 90 though. So perhaps we're being a bit generous, and maybe this should be a 7. This keeps her squarely still in the same tier. Again, another reason why I don't want to order them within tiers. But yeah, yay for Hu Tao. I don't think her practicality is that bad. I don't think it's that hard to, especially to get her dash cancels, not nearly as demanding as her jump cancels. I have her team building a bit on the higher side because I do think that her double hydro doesn't fall off that much. And then finally, Ayaka, we have her at 97k. She's quite strong, but she really acquires that Escoffier. You have some flexibility for the last slot, but it really does. But even not really that much flexibility, because if it's not exactly Shenhe or Yelan, you basically don't have options for that last slot. You're going to lose a lot of DPS. Practicality of 8, because you're going to miss realistically a bunch of her bursts, and you have to do rotations really tight to get everything just right. So, but total team power, she's still fairly strong. I think Ayaka is still okay being in this tier. So that's tier 2, usable / good. And then for supports, oh, there's quite a few. So we're not going to be quite as detailed going through all the support. First of all, we've got our cryo friends. So we've got Rosaria, Kaya. The reason why these characters are considered pretty high on this list is because their combined average of being an okay support for Skirk in a pinch, if you have nothing else and you need cryo application stuff, as well as being like an actual option for Melt Moika as a free-to-play option, make them pretty good. They're only best in slot for flexibility. Their personal damage is pretty low. Offensive utility is sort of medium. Mostly they're in melt enablers realistically for Moika. And then practicality, Kaya not being circle impact is just a little bit better. Of course, we have to rank the infamous support Mualani, basically just used for that Skirk team. But her average ends up still being pretty high because she ends up being the DPS, the ceiling theoretically for Skirk. Not that you'd ever really use her for this, but hey, it's a thing that you can do. Her flexibility, offensive utility, scroll and thrilling tales are quite powerful. And then overall practicality, pretty good. They may be a little bit less just because of inconsistency with always proccing scroll, but overall it leaves her in the same place. Ayaka, similar sort of thing. She can be a burst support for Skirk, as well as a melt support for Ayaka, or for Moika. And in this last DG onslaught, she actually had her time to shine with that cryo application just absolutely obliterating the first phase of the Hara. But this is more just looking at things in general, not just this specific abyss. I know we threw Jean a bone for that one. We probably shouldn't, but she needs it. But as we get into the higher tiers, we're being a little bit more rigorous. But she has a 5 for personal damage. That's mostly looking at the Skirk thing. A 3 for offensive utility, mostly looking at the melt thing. And then overall practicality is not so bad. You just build energy. Might be being a little bit generous having the 5 and both the 5 and 3 when they're both for 2 different teams. You're not really going to get them at the same time, but it is what it is. Mona, mostly again a Skirk bot, but can also be, Mualani support, Moika support. So overall, that's pretty good. Her offensive utility is pretty high. A bit of a lower practicality with your ER need. Low uptime on Omen. Of course, the low uptime is counted for in the DPS, but if you're delayed in getting your DPS out early for whatever reason, then you're just going to fall off. So that's why that's kind of a practicality thing. Nahida can be a burn support, Llama support, mostly realistically a Llama support, but she does some other stuff, aggravate, and it kind of averages out to being around here. Candace weirdly has like quite a few options that actually make her team power quite high because she's not too much of a loss on Skirk. She's actually very competitive for both Arlecchino and for Mualani. So overall, her total team power ends up being reasonably high. Still a DPS loss to free units a lot of the time, so low flexibility. Again, I know that's weird, but that's just how this works. Pretty good buffing, pretty good practicality. Who else might people disagree with? Raiden. People might think that Hyperbloom Raiden should be higher or lower. I feel like it's fairly valuable what she does. She can be a Hyperbloom trigger for Llama teams or Novelette Lauma teams. Tenacity support for overload stuff, kind of cope, but it does work. I did take away 1 point of practicality because if you are using her as a Hyperbloom support, you are losing out on a healer being kooky. So I did take away a point for that. People might think Fischl should be higher. She's going to get a big buff, so she's definitely going to go higher. But why wouldn't I put Fischl higher? Well, basically it's just her peak teams just aren't that crazy. She doesn't have teams that push the high meta. Like Auroron, for example. Well, he actually has a team that pushes higher, which is Moika, but he has no other good teams. So his average ends up being lower because he doesn't have very many good teams. He is best in slot for Moika. But anyways, Fischl, she does pretty good damage. Doesn't have much offensive utility, no defensive utility. Pretty good practicality. Part of me wants to lower this a little bit because the ER stuff in Stygian Onslaught actually can be annoying sometimes, but it's okay. Mostly it's just that for Auroron, like why is an ER? It's because he only really has one good team being Moika, and then a lot of the other teams that he would be used on, it's just like really cope. And then Fischl, she has a bunch of teams, but none of them are super high powered. Some people might think Emily should be higher, but really she's hurt by like only being relevant on Knight teams. She's kind of okay on like Arlecchino teams. And if it's ever shilling burning, it's kind of nice to have Emily. She does lots of damage, doesn't have much in the way of offensive utility, very easy to play, but it's just really that total team power not hitting very high because it's better generally to use reactions. And burning is basically a reactionless team. In most cases, and her just lack of buffing really keeps her down. All right, moving into top meta, we're getting into like actual, or sorry, not top meta, we're getting into like some actual really good characters now. So this time let's start with the supports. So we've got Aino, Kuki, Xingqiu, Xiangling, Skirk, Kazuha, Pyro Traveler, and Yelan. Again, not ordered. I'm hopeful that this won't be too contentious, honestly. Hanging on at the bottom is Kazuha. You know, he's all right. He's basically a downgrade to Sucrose most of the time. You can still get away with using him on a bunch of teams, so I haven't. I think it's mostly like Novelette Hyper that people still use him on, but it's pretty funny. If you look at Flip's calcs, Kazuha isn't used on any of them because he's not best in slot, basically on any teams anymore. Kind of makes me feel like he shouldn't be in the meta. We give him an 8 for power, 90 to 100k. Arlecchino, Novelette. I think although he can hit those, I think he's just too much of a downgrade to Sucrose all the time. So I'm actually going to only give him a 1 for flexibility. I think he's just too much of a downgrade to Sucrose. I think he has to move down. I feel like if I put a character in meta, you have to think to yourself, this is an okay character to wish for, especially a support, you know? I say this is a meta support, and I feel like he doesn't belong with the other characters. Like, sure, you know, Yelan might be top meta, might not be top meta. Xiangling might not be top meta. Pyro Traveler, well, I feel like he just doesn't belong with these other characters. I think I'm really happy with, and we're just going to be like totally real, right? I think I'm really happy with how this tier list works for the on-fielders, and I'm happy with how it works for the the top meta and like the meta off-fielders. I'm not as happy how it works, especially as flexibility and total team power stuff. There's something wrong and it needs to be fixed. It's close enough that I'm like okay to continue doing this, but there's something wrong. So you can expect changes here for the next one, and it's okay. Like, it's okay to have it be wrong, and it's okay to have it be a work in progress, but just so you know that I know that this still needs some work. I think it's workable, but you can see, you know, like, what exactly are we doing here, right? Like, what is a character? It's difficult. How do you rank a character like Kazuha? He's okay, he does some stuff, but he doesn't work on very many teams. I'd say this one comes from, like, if I want to justify it, right, using this format, this one comes from him being like an option on, you know, Hyper Novelette. The total team power comes as a result of him working on as a VV character for a bunch of those teams that we mentioned. And the offensive utility, it makes sense. It's just really this flexibility and total team power combination of 3 teams that's a weakness. It's this flexibility thing that's really weak, but it is important for the top tier. So anyway, keep going. Pyro Traveler, a downgrade option to some really good DPSs, but still very valuable. Skirk as an off-fielder instantly makes any Escoffier team OP. And I know it's really kind of bullshit to have Skirk, you know, as an off-fielder, but if we look at, you know, burst support Skirk, right, it takes Ayaka to 100k plus. If we look at burst support Novelette, it takes Novelette to 114k, and she's doing more damage than Novelette as a burst only character. If we look at burst Skirk with burst Wriothesley, it's 116k. Oh wait, this isn't burst Skirk. This is Wriothesley as a Thrilling Tales support. I have to send this to my friend. Something about this is just very, very funny to me. That's a crazy difference. 84k versus 100. Anyways, I understand if you object to having Skirk be a burst support character because that's like a ridiculous way to play Skirk. I totally get it. I have her flexibility only as 1 because it's only a Escoffier teams that it works. I have a 10 in personal damage. She does the highest personal damage of any off-field character, especially percentage wise. Like, look at that nonsense. 115k when all she does is burst. That's crazy. And then it's very obviously easy to play her. Doesn't need energy, you know, just needs the freeze team. So I think it's you know, it makes sense to have it here, but if you think it's bull, then I totally get it. I know C1, she works really well on a bunch of teams, doesn't do damage, has some decent buffing, and I hate her circle impact, so she really gets punished on practicality for that. Keqing, she is still the premier option for Hyperbloom teams. Realistically, most people are not getting away without a healer. So she's just an integral part of Hyperbloom teams, and it shows. We're counting her personal damage partially with the Hyperblooms, I guess. Some offensive utility, defensive utility, practicality. This is a bit scuffed too. We need to figure this out. Xingqiu's still a valuable support. It's kind of crazy that Xingqiu, I had him knocked down, and then he's come sort of back up again with the advent of Hyperbloom, with the advent of Stygian Onslaught, elemental checks being quite valuable. Some interesting stuff there. Xiangling, still hard to get rid of Xiangling, and then Yelan, still able to do some strong vape stuff, Escoffier stuff, and of course Hyperbloom stuff. So still some really strong options for Yelan. Looking at the meta DPSs, now is where things are going to get spicy for some people. Try not to get too triggered, okay? So starting at the bottom with Chlorand. Chlorand hits over 110k with overloaded teams. Over 100, I don't know if I said 110, over 100k with overloaded teams. Still a good character? Yes. Worse than Verisa? Should you get her? Never. Does she hit over 100k? Yes. She works with Eonsan, which is great. Eonsan, Chevreuse, and Moika being the team that hits over 100k, but still hits pretty close to that. You know, you still have some options without Moika. And even without Eonsan, it's not too big of a loss. But she does get punished pretty heavily on team building for requiring those very specific, you know, requirements, and Chevreuse and Eonsan needing high constellation. Although they are 4 stars that have been on compatible banners, so Chevreuse being on multiple Chlorand banners, Eonsan being on Moika's banner. Despite that, needing C6 or you lose, you know, 10% DPS for each, that's pretty bad. And then practicality, she is liable to be staggered around if you're not really good with her, so she gets an 8 for practicality. Next is Keqing. He breaks 106k with his 5e team, specifically with Emily, Bennett, and Eonsan. Still gets reasonable damage, but you do need to do the 5e, and it is quite difficult. So he's punished pretty heavily for the 5e. He also has pretty annoying team building, so only a 3. But pretty high overall team power. Chaska. Chaska is a very difficult one. I'm going to get a lot of hate for what I've done with Chaska here because I've given her Moika Melt team. So I've punished her team building. I know you can swap out for Farina and whatever, but I've punished her team building and I've given her a higher team power. I do think she is a really good option for Melt Moika, even especially when elemental application is important, when Night Soul is important, when multiple damage types are important. There is an argument for Chaska, and there have been multiple Stygians where she's been competitive to other forms of Moika teams. So I've given her Melt Moika. If you want, you can really lower her damage to give her more flexibility. But the thing is, like, if you give Chaska more flexibility and you start using her more cope team options, pretty quickly you're going below 100k. You're going below 90k. And she's really taking a massive damage hit, and I'm sorry. So, but this is on-field Chaska. You know, this is, you know, Chaska doing the most damage on the team. This is not VV Chaska. This is real DPS Chaska. So I think it's okay. We've just punished her team building for it. And she will get a new option with Durin, which will help this. For sure, one way or the other, she will be getting some kind of buff from Durin. Next, we have Lauma. So this is on-fielder Lauma, and I have used her numbers from Keqing. If you were able to use Raiden, and no healer, you could actually raise this power, but I think it's too impractical. So we've given her a total team power of 8 for just hitting over 100k. Some reasonable team building options, because you can do different Hydros. You can do Nahida instead of Yelan. And practicality, it's like fine. You have to keep an eye on cooldowns and like really be on top of switching and rotations to make sure, and so that's why she sort of has an 8, and there's difficult energy stuff and it can be annoying. So that's Lauma, and she can brute force a bunch of Stygians. She really does have some pretty good DPS even just as that Hyperbloom teams. Next is Novelet. I know a lot of people, There's going to be some people that really think Neuvillette deserves to be in tier 0.5, and I know that there's going to be a lot of comments. I just think that I can't quite do it for one reason. It's that his teams that hit over 105k are Inefa plus Lauma teams, and I just can't justify actually imagining this scenario where someone uses both Inefa and Lauma reasonably. Like, sure, if you have an Inefa and Lauma free on your account and it's not griefing your other teams to build that team, honestly, you can move him up to tier 0.5. I don't have a problem with that. That's okay. But I think most people are not in that situation, and so it's disingenuous to count this team. He can take either Inefa or Lauma, but not both. And if he takes one or the other, it's just over 100k. And yeah, Escoffier stuff is below 100k. Hyper stuff is below 100k. So this is where he is. He does have some decent team building, but it is very expensive. There's not very much free-to-playness. It's all 5 stars, you know? Like, sure, I know he has a million buffs. He has a million characters. He's got Inefa. He's got Lauma. He's got Durin coming, he's got Kazuha, he's got Farina, he's got Shallonen, but they're all 5 stars and none of them are free, and that makes it difficult. Team building is how easy it is to make good teams. It's a bit difficult because he's very 5-star hungry. So that's the Neuvillette. The final thing about Neuvillette is that he's not as easy to play as you think he is. And I know I sound insane for saying this, but when you look at his rotations to actually get 100k, most people are not doing them. Most people are not doing his best rotations, and they're not getting these numbers. With his Hyper Bloom, for example, to even hit 104k, you actually have to cancel his charge attack early to make your rotations shorter. Do you do this? I doubt it. You have to constantly be making sure all of your buffs are being refreshed and like sort of offset disjointed rotations. And it's actually not that easy to do to get the high DPS numbers that we're talking about. Plus, like, here's a big one. That's just one. That wouldn't justify an 8 all in of itself. Don't get me wrong. But the other one is if you're not using Inefa, boy, is he awful to play without a shielder. I know all of you guys have C1, but we're generally counting C0 characters here. So yeah. Neuvillette, everybody. Okay, Mualani hits 100k. She's got a bunch of team building options. Very free to play friendly. Not many of her calcs actually hit 100k, but the way that GC Sim works, but the way that most people's standards for calculating works, not GC Sim, but just Keqing main standards, most theory crafters, the way that they work is that they take a certain amount of substats and allow them to have those. But Mualani has more useful substats available, so it's easier to get a better build with Mualani. So on average, she'll be doing more damage. So I have given her a bit of leeway and given her a bit more flexible with, you know, more teams will hit 100k in practice than the sheets will say. Doesn't make that much of a difference. It basically allows me to say she's more flexible for team building than she is. But even if we change this to a 3, she's still going to be like in this tier, right? She's going to be 17.9, but 3 is unreasonable. But even if we made it a 4, it's still like in this tier, right? Or a 3.5, she's still in this tier. But I do think she is like that. We did give her a bit of a hit for practicality because of the reset thing. But I think to hit the DPS thresholds needed for most Stygians that you want to use her, it's not too bad. I think the common through line for all of these characters is that they're not always going to be able to clear Stygian easily, but often they will, and that's sort of like, you know, how it sort of goes. But yeah. Okay, and then Arlecchino. So I had Arlecchino a little bit higher. We had some backlash. It was a whole thing. If you don't go on Reddit. But it made me revisit some Arlecchino calcs again. And if we're looking at more reasonable assumptions, we're getting about 103k for her melt teams. She still does have overload, Inefa, overvape, and other stuff like that. She has a bit of practicality issues with every time you heal, you clear your bond of life, you're not going to keep the same DPS numbers. But overall, I think she's quite a solid DPS, and she's just barely at the top of tier 1. So yeah. That is tier 1. So now on to top meta. So we'll go to tier 0.5 first. So DPS and support. Starting with support, we've got Sucrose. Kind of unbelievable how a 1.0 meta at a 1.0 unit, not just Bennett, but another 1.0 unit is this high up. Total team power at 9.5. The average of her best teams are all super, super high between Moika, Mualani, etc., etc. Maybe we should do the DPS first. It'd be easier to reference the top DPSs. So maybe I don't know. Maybe we'll finish this off. But let's take a look at the top DPSs. So we've got Varesa, Nefer, and Flynn's. Varesa and Nefer are both above 100k, 110k. So they hit a total team power of 9. Very, very high. Nefer, I would say, is much better team building. Basically, as long as she has Llama, you can do whatever. And so this is definitely a pro for Nefer. Team building, I've given basically a 3.5. If you're locked to one other character, I give you a 3.5, basically, is how the team building ended up working out relatively. But I do have a practicality a little bit lower because the do generation can be an issue. The survivability can be an issue. She's just lacking properly good teammates. So overall, that's where she lands. Varesa in a very different boat, reaching around the same DPS, but has the same problem we talked about with Clorand, is if you don't have C6 Chev, you lose 10%. If you don't have C6 Yansan, you lose 10%. If you don't have Muika, you lose 7%. So team building, I feel like 4 stars are so hard to get, and if she runs again with both Chevruz and Yansan, maybe we consider rising this up again. If people are like more consistently getting C6 Chev and Yansan, maybe if they're given free, but it's like, it's so difficult, and I feel like it's unrealistic to just assume that people can get those things, and if you lose those things, it really hurts her. So I've punished her team building quite a bit, and we can go back and forth on whether this should be higher or lower. I certainly have. But that's where she's ended up. If you have them though, like again, we can experiment, right? We can say if you have them, you know, and it's easy to play, then she moves up to the top of this tier, right? So that's a thing as well. And then at the top of tier 0.5, we actually have Flint. And I know people are going to be super surprised by this, but sure, he has 107k DPS, which is just a bit lower than these two. It is higher than all of tier 1 though, just let's be real here. But yeah, 8.5, and then his team building is a 3.5 because yes, he does need an EFA, but it's this practicality score that makes him the highest. And if you've played Flynn's, like, I do think he's a bit boring. However, with boring comes ease, and boy, is it hard to mess up playing this character. Like, you get all of his DPS out all the time, and so in practice, I generally find my Flynn's clearing faster than my Nefer, clearing often as fast or faster than my Varesa, just because he's so freaking easy to play. So we have Flynn's. But again, I will repeat, tier 0.5 is not ordered. So if you think that Varesa is higher, if you think Flynn's is higher, if you think Nefer is higher, totally fine with me. I don't care. I think they all have different pros and cons, and they all fall within this range, I think. And they're all very clearly within the same range looking at the numbers. So, okay. Number 2 DPS is of course Skirk, and I think this is pretty obvious. Anyone could have seen this coming. She has crazy DPS, and I put 122k here, but this is with a fairly basic combo that most people should pretty easily be able to get with just a teensy bit of dash canceling. It's really not hard. And then more, but it's by far not the sweatiest combo possible. You can get way more DPS, like even flip calced at 128k, which is a lot higher than what I'm using, and that's a pretty easy combo as well. Like, this is actually a dash canceling combo. This is actually a dash canceling combo that you mess up a little bit, right? I even lowered her DPS a little bit, and that's because I wanted to keep the practicality score, because I think most people just mash, right? So I don't want to like put something that people aren't actually doing on here. I think that Nefer's dash cancels are very easy. It's mostly the survivability and the do generation that's annoying here, and like the rotations and things like that are like annoying. But yeah, Skirk, very easy. And if we look at GC Sim, if we look at some crazy combos that people do, she can hit over 150k or 140k, 138k, right? She can hit a lot higher. And the same is absolutely true for Moika. So, but another thing is, another reason why I did this is because for her team building, I made it a 3.5 because she relies on Escoffier to hit this type of DPS, but you can also get this type of DPS without needing both Escoffier and Farina, right? So if we're looking at Yelan, she's still getting 113k DPS, very high still higher than anyone else on this list. You know, maybe we even make it a 3 because she kind of wants Farina as well. Maybe people will feel better about that. And her last slot's completely flexible. It can literally be anything. I don't even know if I don't know if 3 or 3.5 is fair. I don't really know. I don't think it's much harder to build a Skirk team as it is a Flynn's team. I mean, you kind of want Farina, I guess, right? But even then, you kind of don't really need it. I don't know. I could go back and forth. I could go either way. But Moika, so what we've done with Moika is a very similar thing, and she is of course by far the strongest. You know, the strongest DPS in the game. And this is with, you know, a very basic combo that everyone should do. You're still gonna miss some melts, and there's still, you know, the application can be a little bit annoying, so for a bit lower for practicality, but a very high team building. But if you want to really min-max her, there's all sorts of crazy new combos that Butterfur has talked about, that Jeff made a video about. that you can crack out like 150k, 160k DPS with some crazy combos, but then you got to lower the practicality score to the floor. And I just don't really want to bother with that. I don't think you need that most of the time. I think you're clearing things without it. So I'm more happy to have a bit more modest DPS, especially since these two are so head and shoulders above the rest. I'm more happy to have a more modest DPS to give them more leeway in, you know, Skirk's team building, right? And a leeway in, you know, in Moika's practicality, stuff like that. All right, now for the off-fielders. Let's just take a look. We'll just take a look. So for the off-fielders, starting with Sucrose. Sucrose being a top option for Moika and for Flynn's, and arguably for Nefer, and for Mualani, and for Arlecchino. That's pretty crazy. So Sucrose has crazy total team power, crazy flexibility, not much personal damage, none in fact, but crazy offensive utility with VV and Elemental Mastery buffing and Thrilling Tales. No defensive utility, and very easy to use. I don't think the Sucrose cringe stuff makes any sense. Is it hard to press E? No, we're not double swirling anymore. There it is. So Farina. Farina, pretty high team power at 9.5. She's very good with Skirk. She works well with Moika. She works well with Flynn. She works well with Verisa. She works well with Never. Like, she works pretty well with the teams. She's not really best in slot with a lot of them, but we still give her, and that's why we punish her flexibility a little bit, because she does work good with them, but she's not as best in slot. So again, the weakness of our tier list is definitely the flexibility column. It's showing, it's okay, but it's showing pretty good personal damage, pretty good offensive utility, not as good as it once was, because damage bonus is not as good as it has always been, but practicality, and she's very easy to use. So Farina, very, very excellent character. Shilonen. So, I gotta lower her flexibility. I think that Shilonen, she has a very high total team power. And sure, she is flexible. She works with Moika. She can work with Freysa. She's very good with Mualani, with Arlecchino, with Novelet. But I feel like she's like not as flexible as she once was. I feel like even that might be a bit too high. You know, I still think she belongs in tier 0.5, but I feel like her flexibility is falling off. She's not super, super good with as many characters. I do still think the TLDR, I do think she still is worth it for Moika, but other than that, it's kind of rough. Personal damage doesn't do any. Offensive utility, very useful. Defensive utility, it's okay, but it's going to be a DPS loss to use it, so I don't want to rank it too high. And then practicality at a 4.5. Sometimes you can't activate scroll properly, and that really messes it up. Certain Stygian bosses with shields and stuff can make it really weird. And then if you have to use Archaic Petra, and if you have to heal, and there's some problems. But like, you just look at the top, you know, the top teams and realize that most of them don't use Shilonen. So it's like, she's not a must pull like she used to be anymore. I still think she's good. I still think she belongs in this tier, but yeah. And then Inefa and Lauma. So they actually have a little bit lower of a total team power because they don't work with Moika and Skirk, and Moika and Skirk sort of carry the other three characters. But to compensate for that, they kind of do a lot more. Like, they're the ones sort of carrying their team a bit more. So Lauma doing some personal damage, doing a lot of work in the offensive utility department, and then very easy to play. You know, she essentially makes Nefer viable, right? She's pulling a lot of weight, and then Inefa is doing a very similar thing. You know, some of the highest personal damage, you know, one of three characters getting a 10 for personal damage. Offensive utility doesn't do as much buffing, but still provides some offensive utility, defensive utility, and then practicality being very high. So pretty good shielder, very easy to play, super brain dead. And then moving into tier 0, we have Moika. So actually a lower total team power as well, because big surprise, taking the best DPS off of your DPS and putting her as a support is going to be a DPS loss. I feel like this is close enough that I think it makes a bit more sense actually to put Moika into tier 0.5, which just intuitively I kind of like the idea better, but also the numbers just sort of match up a bit better. Really high personal damage, some offensive utility, quite easy to use, but just like, it's that total team power that prevents her from being a tier 0 character, I think. Because sure, she's supporting Verisa, she's supporting Clorand, but, you know, they're kind of, and she's supporting a lot of these characters and carrying them, you know, carrying Chaska, carrying Mualani, but not to the levels of, you know, her own teams, you know, like other supports carry her or help her. So Chevreuse is next. I saw some people think that Chevreuse is the best character in the game. I do not agree with that, or the best support in the game. I don't agree with that, but I do think she is incredibly strong. It's her total team power is what holds her being back from like being the best character. It's just Verisa, yeah, and Overload Moika, yeah, they're very good, but it's not Melt Moika, it's not Skirk. Yeah, pretty good flexibility, works with a lot of carries, doesn't really do damage, but very crazy buffing, some good healing, and then very, very easy to use. Definitely belongs in tier 0. We have Yeonsan in tier 0 as well. Keep in mind, both of these are tier 6. I have added, you know, you can do -2 to the team power if it's not. So if we give Chevreuse a 7 instead, that pushes her down into the tier 0.5, which is what I agree with. And then same with Yeonsan, if we put an 8, that pushes her down to the tier 0.5. So this is including C6, but yeah, so they basically just go down a tier if not. Yeonsan a little bit worse flexibility than someone like Chevreuse, but still works with a lot of characters, works with Muika, Avaresa, Arlecchino arguably, Kenichi, Clorant, and Chaska, still very prevalent among the top meta units. Probably I could see Yeonsan going down over in the future as less characters use her, but there you go, personal damage. She does at least some insane offensive utility between the huge attack buff and scroll, and then damage bonus as well. Defensive utility, I have it as a 3. I feel like that might be a bit generous. I feel like maybe a 2 makes more sense. And then practicality, a little bit ER issues here and there, but it's not too bad really. Next we have Citlali. I think some people are going to think Citlali's a bit of a sneak, but the fact is she's the best in slot support for the best DPS in the game by a mile. She's also sometimes like half the time or a third of the time best in slot support for Skirk as well. So she has some flexibility. She does a little bit of personal damage. I don't know how much that really is, but even if we lower it, it doesn't really change all that much here. Offensive utility, she provides Thrilling Tales as well as Scroll as well as Shred. Seems pretty strong to me. And then defensive utility, you have a 5, and then practicality at a 4 because the ER issues, the passing scroll can be annoying sometimes. Procking scroll can be annoying sometimes. I think you can say what you want about some of these things, but the fact is she ends up being best in slot for Muika and half the time for Skirk. She's best in slot for Arlecchino, for Mualani, for Chaska. I feel like that's pretty good. You know what I'm saying? I feel like Citlali is a pretty damn good character. And yeah, you know, Muika Melt can use other stuff, but I feel like it's still pretty good. And I do think worthy of tier 0 based on how the criteria shake down. Next, of course, the Pyro Archon himself, Bennett. Absolutely integral to Muika's teams. Not as flexible as he once was. You know, other than Muika, you know, not really appearing in the top 5. Works with Arlecchino, with Kenichi, but that's kind of it. Chaska would prefer Yeonsan, so like a bit more of a niche support than he used to be, but because he's still best in slot for by far the best DPS in the game, and still very good for Avaresa and, you know, Arlecchino, etc. Still an excellent support, obviously. I feel like there's a reasonable argument to lower his flexibility a little bit because it's just not as many characters as it used to be. It doesn't really do personal damage. Crazy offensive utility we have. The highest is reserved for just Yeonsan and Bennett. Some pretty good defensive utility with healing. Practicality being 4. First circle impact, we're taking it a little bit away. And then number 1, which is weird to me. I didn't expect this. I wouldn't have just put Escoffier at number 1. I'm not gonna lie. I think it's just like the sheer number of things. And it's, you know, maybe you could argue this is a flaw in the system because she just does so, but if you think about it, it's not necessarily a flaw. She just does so many things well. So many things crazy, insanely well. Like, okay, so total team power, we have it at 10 because, yeah, she's best in slot with Skirk, but she's also best in slot with Muika Melt and Arlecchino Melt. I know it's a bit weird to grief your freeze team by using double cryo with Escoffier, but she's also the best non-Escoffier option for Muika Melt, for Arlecchino Melt, because she follows you around. She's got a bit more consistent cryo application because her summon follows you around, unlike Rosaria's. So, and then of course, yeah, so I don't know, I think it's still kind of justified to have her there. I have lowered her flexibility a little bit, you know, because there's not just a crazy amount of characters. So she is like the lowest flexibility of most of these characters, but it's still pretty high. She does pretty good damage. If you look at the damage distribution, it's a pretty good amount of damage. Not as crazy as some of the characters, but it's still quite good. So pretty high offensive utility, but it's not maxing out or anything. It's just a lot of res shred for cryo, which is very good. And then of course the defensive utility, I feel like she has the best healing in the game, being a team-wide healing, so it can max out Farina, and it just makes you pretty much unkillable, and she's very easy to play with some energy issues, but she works really well with Fav. So there it is. Overall, I feel amazing about the on-fielder list, and I feel like about 65% satisfied with the off-field list. It's not terrible. I feel like maybe there's a bit too many categories somehow, but also mostly it's just the flexibility category is not ideal. But while we're here, let's update the list, and you can check this out for yourself. So if you want to stay up to date on my thoughts, I'll be updating this all the time. So this will stay relatively updated all the time, believe it or not. And I will have this linked down below in the comments and the description so that you can stay up to date on my thoughts on the tier list whenever I get around to updating it. And if you have thoughts, you know, you can reach out to me on Discord, but I may or may not get to you. But despite the objectivity, you know, despite my unhappiness with the objectivity portion of the support list, I do think that I'm quite pleased. Oh, we didn't lower Kazuha down. With how it ended up looking in the end. You know, how it ends up looking overall. I think I agree with these placements. Maybe Sijuin's too high. I don't know. But let me know your thoughts. I'm sure people will have plenty to say in the comments. And, you know, let me down. I probably won't be reading the comments, but do let me know your thoughts. Please subscribe. And if you don't want to do that, that is totally fine. Just watching the video has been more than enough. Thanks so much. Bye for now.